Toddler discovered a German shepherd trapped in a school bus yard. The ending left all in tears. Think you've seen kindness? Think again. What happens when a child, with nothing but pure heart, saves a life in the most incredible way? You'll be shocked, touched, and inspired. Trust me, this is a story you won't forget. Like, share, and subscribe. This one's for the ages. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky still hung heavy and gray over the little town. Puddles stretched across the cracked road, and the wind carried the smell of wet metal and damp grass. At the edge of the town stood an old school bus yard, long forgotten. Rusting yellow buses leaned against each other like tired giants. Their windows were cracked, their paint peeling, and weeds crawled high around their wheels. No one ever went there anymore. It was a place the grown-ups said was dangerous, a place children were told to avoid. Yet that afternoon, a small figure wandered close. Emma, just 3 years old, walked slowly along the narrow path beside the yard. She clutched a little toy in her hand, her bright pink dress splashed with raindrops, her shoes tapping softly on the wet ground. To her, the world was always a place of wonder, even in forgotten corners. She liked the way the raindrops sparkled on broken glass, the way the wind whispered secrets through the empty bus windows. As she passed the iron fence, she stopped suddenly. Something had reached her ears. At first, she thought it was just the wind whistling between the buses. But no, this sound was different. It was faint, shaky, and carried a weight that tugged at her heart. A cry. A plea. Emma pressed closer to the fence, her tiny fingers curling around the cold iron bars. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered through the misty space between the buses. That was when she saw them, two glowing eyes, shining from the shadows. For a moment, fear froze her. The eyes blinked, and then came another sound, soft and broken. A bark. Not the strong, bold bark of a healthy dog. This one was weak, trembling, as though every ounce of strength was fading away. And then she saw him. A German shepherd, chained tightly to an old wheel buried in the mud. His fur was soaked and clung to his body. His ribs showed through his sides, and one paw lifted weakly from the cold water that had gathered around him. The chain kept him from moving more than a few inches, and each time he tried, it rattled against the metal with a sharp, hopeless sound. Emma's big eyes filled with tears. She was too little to understand why he was there, or who had left him. But she understood enough. He was trapped. He was alone. And he was asking for help the only way he could. The wind whistled again, but this time Emma didn't mistake it for the dog's cry. She knew exactly what she had heard. Her tiny hand pressed tighter on the fence, her toy falling forgotten into the wet grass. The German shepherd raised his head just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes, though tired and full of pain, carried a spark, fear mixed with hope. In that moment, a bond was made. And the story began. Because what Emma did next would not only save a life, but awaken an entire town. The little town was the kind that most people drove through without slowing down. One long road cut through the center, lined with a bakery, a gas station, and a single grocery store with faded paint on its sign. The houses were small and close together, each with porches where neighbors sometimes waved at each other, though more often than not, everyone was too busy to stop and talk. Life here was quiet, steady, and perhaps a little worn down. It was here, at the very edge of this town, that Emma lived with her parents. Emma was only 3 years old, small for her age, with eyes that seemed to catch everything the world offered. She was the kind of child who paused to study a ladybug on a leaf, who laughed at the sound of rain tapping against the windows, who held her little toy even in sleep as if it carried the secrets of her days. Sweet, innocent, and endlessly curious, Emma was the kind of light that softened even the hardest day. Her mother, Nadia, worked long hours as a nurse. She was gentle but strong, The kind of woman who carried exhaustion in her shoulders yet never failed to kneel down and press a kiss to Emma's forehead. Her father, David, worked as a mechanic in the town's only auto shop. His hands were rough from years of turning wrenches, but when he lifted Emma into his arms, his touch was always tender. They had moved here only a few months earlier, seeking a quieter life after too many years in a crowded city. The house they rented sat on a narrow street, its backyard stretching toward a chain-link fence. Beyond that fence was the old school bus yard. The yard was a place forgotten by time. Rows of yellow buses, once bright and filled with laughter, now stood abandoned. Their windows were cracked, their wheels sunken into the earth. Rust ate away at their bodies, and tall grass swallowed their outlines. Some leaned against each other like tired soldiers, others stood apart with shadows inside their hollow frames. Children were told not to go near. The fences were broken in places, the ground uneven and dangerous. But perhaps the real reason no one ventured close was simpler. It felt like a place where voices of the past still lingered, where laughter had turned to silence. Emma had heard her mother tell her more than once, "Stay away from that bus yard, my love. It isn't safe." Her father agreed, shaking his head when he saw the loose boards and jagged pieces of metal sticking out from the ground. To the adults, it was nothing more than a hazard, a place they wished would be torn down. But to Emma's young eyes, it was something else entirely. She would often pause near the edge of the fence during her small walks with Nadia. While her mother checked her phone for messages from the hospital, Emma would stand still, staring through the gaps at the silent buses. She didn't know why, but it felt as though the buses were keeping secrets. Their cracked windows looked like watching eyes, their doors closed tight like lips refusing to speak. She would tilt her head, holding her little toy in her hands, and simply listen. The town itself was a reflection of this mood. People were kind enough, but most kept to themselves. The baker cared about his bread, the grocer about his shelves, and the mechanic shop about the cars that came and went. Everyone seemed busy chasing their own lives, too hurried to notice the small things, the rusting yard, the broken fence, or the silence that hung over the old buses. It was just part of the scenery now, as common as the cracked sidewalks or the peeling paint on the town hall. But Emma noticed. One afternoon, when the sun broke through heavy clouds after a long night of rain, she and her mother walked past the yard again. Water clung to the grass, dripping into puddles that reflected the gray sky. Nadia, tired from her shift, tightened her coat against the breeze and urged Emma forward. Yet the little girl slowed her steps, her eyes fixed on the buses. She stood still, as if waiting for something to stir within the hollow yard. Nadia turned back and sighed. "Emma, come on, sweetheart. It's just an old place. Nothing for you there." But Emma didn't move right away. She pressed her small hands against the fence, peering in, her face thoughtful. From behind those rusted giants, there seemed to be a whisper, a feeling that the yard was more than just abandoned metal and weeds. Emma didn't know the word for it yet, but her heart felt it. A pull. As if the buses weren't finished telling their story, as if something, or someone, was waiting behind them. Her toy slipped from her hand and hit the wet ground with a soft thud. She bent to pick it up, her dress brushing against the grass. When she looked up again, her eyes lingered on a shadow moving between the buses. She frowned, blinking, wondering if it was just her imagination. Her mother's voice broke the moment. "Come on, love. We'll be late." Emma obeyed, her little shoes splashing in the puddles as she ran to catch up. But as they walked home, she glanced over her shoulder. The buses stood silent again, yet her heart whispered something she couldn't quite name. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, a story began to take shape. The afternoon was warmer than usual after days of rain, but the ground was still soft with mud and the air carried that damp smell of wet earth. Emma wandered close to the old bus yard, clutching her small toy as she skipped along the fence line. Her laughter was soft, like a little melody carried by the breeze. To her, the world was still a place of endless wonder, where even broken leaves and rusty fences were things to explore. She pressed her toy against the cold metal bars, pretending the fence was a tiny stage for her play. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from between the rows of buses. Everything felt still, too still, until something broke through the silence. At first, it was so faint that Emma thought she had imagined it. A short, broken sound, almost lost in the air. She tilted her head, her curls brushing her cheeks, and waited. There it was again. A low cry, trembling and thin. Emma froze, her toy slipping a little from her hands. Her heart, too young to understand fear the way adults do, understood something else: sadness. The kind of sadness that made her chest tighten. Slowly, step by step, she walked closer to the fence, her tiny shoes sinking into the soft earth. She pressed her face between the bars and peered into the shadows between the buses. At first, she saw only rusted yellow paint and weeds that climbed high around the wheels. But then, deeper in the gloom, she caught the glimmer of eyes. Not hard, sharp eyes, but tired ones, eyes that begged silently for someone to notice. Emma gasped softly. The eyes blinked, and the figure behind them shifted. A German shepherd. His body trembled as he tried to stand, but the heavy chain around his neck pulled him back, clinking against an old wheel half buried in the mud. His fur was drenched and matted, clinging to his thin frame. His ribs showed, each one visible against the weak rise and fall of his breath. He had been left there. Emma didn't understand how or why, but she knew it in her heart. No one was coming for him. The dog lifted his head just enough to look at her. For a moment, their eyes locked, hers wide and innocent, his filled with a mix of fear and something else. A flicker of hope. His tail gave the smallest twitch, a motion so faint it could have been mistaken for nothing. But Emma saw it, and that was enough. She dropped to her knees in the wet grass, her little dress gathering stains. Her small fingers reached through the cold bars, stretching toward him even though he was too far to touch. Her voice came out as a whisper, soft and trembling. "Don't worry," she said. "I see you." The dog's ears flickered at the sound of her voice, as though it reached him in a place deeper than the chain around his neck. He let out a soft whine, and Emma's chest ached. She tugged at the gate, her little hands pulling with all the strength her tiny body had. The rusty lock rattled but didn't give. She tried again, pushing this time, grunting with effort, her toy forgotten in the mud. But the gate didn't move. It was too heavy, too old, and she was too small. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She looked back at the shepherd, who was watching her with desperate patience, as though he wanted to tell her, "Please don't leave." But what could she do? She pulled back from the fence and stumbled to her feet, wiping her wet hands against her dress. She turned and ran. Her small legs carried her as fast as they could, splashing through puddles, her curls bouncing as she went. At home, her mother was in the kitchen, her phone balanced between her shoulder and ear as she stirred a pot on the stove. Emma burst through the door, her cheeks red and her breaths coming quick. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing back toward the bus yard. "Mama," she tried to say with all the words she knew, but they tumbled out in a rush, broken and hard to understand. Her tiny voice lifted in urgency, but Nadia, distracted with the call and the dinner, only smiled tiredly and shushed her. "Emma, not now, love. Go wash your hands. Dinner will be ready soon." Emma stamped her foot, her little face twisted in frustration. She pulled harder at her mother's sleeve, pointing again, her voice rising. But Nadia, overwhelmed with the noise of the kitchen and the words on the phone, gently guided Emma to the side. "Later, sweetheart," she said, her eyes full of love but also fatigue. Emma's heart sank. She looked toward her father in the other room, his hands deep in a pile of tools as he tried to fix something from the shop. She hurried over, tugging at his pant leg, her words tumbling fast and broken. He glanced down with a smile, brushing his greasy hands on a rag. "Emma, what's wrong?" he asked gently, but his eyes kept drifting back to the parts spread across the floor. She pointed again, gesturing wildly toward the yard, her voice squeaking with urgency. But David only laughed softly, not understanding. "Play later, love," he said, patting her head. "Daddy has to finish this first." Emma's shoulders slumped. She stood there for a moment, small and helpless in the middle of the room. The dog's eyes burned in her memory. His weak bark echoed in her ears. No one else had heard him. No one else had seen him. She turned slowly toward the door, her toy still in the mud outside where she had dropped it. Her little heart, though full of innocence, carried a weight that no 3-year-old should bear. She knew one thing with all the certainty her small world allowed. If she didn't help him, no one would. Emma's little legs carried her back toward the bus yard, her shoes splashing through puddles as she ran. Her heart was pounding, though she didn't quite understand why. It was not fear exactly, but urgency. The dog was still there, alone, and she couldn't let the moment slip away. Near the entrance to the yard stood Mr. Daniels, the old caretaker. His gray cap was pulled low over his forehead, and his heavy coat looked damp from the drizzle. He was a man the children of town both respected and feared, kind in his own way, but always strict, always reminding them of rules. He had worked at the bus yard long before it was abandoned, and though his knees ached and his back bent with age, he still walked its fences every day, as if watching over ghosts from the past. Emma spotted him and tugged at his sleeve with all her might. "Come, come," she urged in her small voice, her hand pointing toward the rows of rusting buses. Mr. Daniels frowned, looking down at the child with confusion. "What are you doing here, little one? You shouldn't be near this place. It's dangerous." His voice was stern, the way grown-ups sound when they think they know best. But Emma didn't let go. Her tiny fingers held tight to the fabric of his coat. She pulled again, her eyes wide and shining, her lips trembling with words she couldn't form fast enough. He shook his head. "Nonsense. No dogs here. Only old buses and broken glass. Now off you go." Emma stomped her little foot on the wet ground, refusing to move. She pointed again, her hand trembling as her voice rose, insistent this time. "Dog. Her. Please." Something in her tone made Mr. Daniels pause. He had never seen the usually shy toddler so fierce, so determined. He sighed, muttering under his breath, and finally followed where she pointed. Together, they walked to the fence. Mr. Daniels squinted into the shadows between the buses, his eyes narrowed with doubt. But then he saw it. His breath caught and his lined face went pale. There, chained to a rusted wheel, was the German Shepherd. The rainwater had collected around the base of the buses, pooling into shallow streams. The dog's paws were already soaked, his body trembling as he tried to balance on the thin patch of dry ground that remained. Each time he shifted, the chain rattled, pulling tighter around his neck. "My lord," Mr. Daniels whispered, his sternness vanishing. "How long has he been there?" The shepherd tried to lift his head, eyes dull yet filled with a pleading light. His ribs showed clearly, his fur matted against his fragile frame. When he saw Emma again, a faint sound escaped him, a broken whimper, like the last hope of a soul left too long in darkness. Emma pressed her hands against the fence, her small body trembling. "See," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help him." Mr. Daniels shook his head, his hand pressing against the cold bars as he studied the situation. "That chain is thick," he muttered. "I'll need tools. Bolt cutters, maybe." They're back at my shed." He turned, already stepping away. But behind him came another sound, the splash of water and the sharp clatter of the chain. He looked back just in time to see the shepherd's legs give out. The dog slipped, his body collapsing into the shallow pool. He struggled weakly, the water creeping higher against his chest. His cry was faint, desperate, and it made even the old caretaker's heart twist. Emma let out a gasp, tears springing to her eyes. She crouched by the fence, her tiny hands reaching through as far as they could go, though the dog was still far beyond her reach. She shook her head fiercely, her curls damp and sticking to her cheeks. "No!" she cried, her voice shrill with determination. Mr. Daniels cursed under his breath and rushed to the gate, tugging at the old lock. It held firm, rusted solid. "It'll take me a few minutes to fetch the cutters," he muttered, half to himself, half in reassurance to the child. But Emma refused to leave. She planted herself in the wet grass by the fence, sitting as close as she could. Her toy lay forgotten beside her, her dress soaking through as she leaned forward. She pressed her tiny face between the bars and whispered to the dog as though her words alone could hold him above the water. "It's okay," she murmured. "I see you. Don't be scared. I'm here." The German shepherd's eyes flickered open at the sound. Weak though he was, his gaze locked on her, as if drawing strength from the child's unwavering presence. His tail twitched faintly in the water, the smallest sign of hope, fragile yet alive. Mr. Daniels stopped, turning back to look at the little girl. Something about the sight froze him. A toddler, soaked in rain, refusing to walk away. A broken animal, clinging to life only because someone so small, believed he was worth saving. The old man swallowed hard. "Hold on, boy," he muttered. "Hold on for her." Then he turned and hurried toward his shed, his footsteps splashing against the muddy ground. Emma stayed, whispering gently, her hands reaching through the bars, her voice carrying the kind of faith only a child's heart could hold. The sky had darkened again by the time Mr. Daniels came running back from his shed. In his weathered hands, he carried a heavy pair of bolt cutters, their jaws streaked with rust from years of disuse. Behind him trailed two neighbors who had heard his hurried call for help. One was Mrs. Lopez, a kind woman who lived across the street, still wearing her apron from the kitchen. The other was young Adam, a college student who had been walking home when the caretaker waved him down. They all hurried to the gate where Emma still sat on the ground, her little hands pressed between the iron bars, whispering to the German shepherd who had barely moved. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Lopez breathed when her eyes fell on the dog. "How long has he been there?" Mr. Daniels didn't answer. His jaw was tight as he lifted the bolt cutters and set them against the lock that kept the yard sealed. The lock had clung to that gate for decades, untouched, rust woven deep into its bones. He pushed down hard on the cutters, his old arms straining, but the lock refused to give. Adam stepped forward. "Let me try." His young muscles pressed the handles together, the cutters squealing as metal scraped against metal. Still the lock held. Behind them, a low rumble echoed across the sky. Raindrops began to fall, soft at first, then quicker, pattering against the buses, the ground, and the trembling back of the German shepherd. The dog shifted weakly, his paws slipping in the growing puddle beneath him. His whimper cut through the air, thin and frightened. Emma pressed closer to the bars, her small voice urgent. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "We're here." The shepherd's eyes found hers again. Even with the rain streaking down his face and his ribs showing like sharp lines against his skin, there was trust in his gaze. Trust in a child who would not leave him. Mrs. Lopez knelt by Emma, trying to keep her from pressing too close. But the little girl shook her head, her curls damp, her dress heavy with rain. She slid her toy, her tiny wooden truck, paint chipped from play, through the bars, pushing it toward the shepherd. The dog lifted his nose weakly. His tongue brushed Emma's small fingers, a soft lick that seemed to say, "I hear you. I know you care." Mrs. Lopez's throat caught, and even Mr. Daniels paused at the sight. For a moment, none of them were rescuers and bystanders. They were witnesses to a fragile bond being born in the rain. "Try again," Mr. Daniels barked, shaking himself from the spell. He set the bolt cutters back in place. With Adam's help, they pressed down hard, their muscles trembling with effort. A metallic crack rang out, sharp against the storm. The lock snapped. The gate swung open with a rusty scream, and the rescuers surged forward. The dog whimpered, trying to push himself up, but the heavy chain around his neck pulled him back. His legs slid under him, his body trembling from exhaustion. "Chain's thick," Adam said, crouching beside the shepherd. The iron links dug deep into the mud, caked with rust. Mr. Daniels dropped to his knees, setting the bolt cutters against the chain. He pushed down, the jaws squeezing against the metal. Nothing. He adjusted, tried again. The rain came harder, slicking his hands, making the cutters slide. His old arms shook from the strain. "It's no use," Mrs. Lopez cried. "It's too thick." But Emma was still kneeling by the fence, her voice steady despite the storm. "Don't stop. Please don't stop." The dog's eyes never left hers. His breaths came short and ragged, but in them was a silent plea, "I will wait. Just don't give up." Mr. Daniels grit his teeth. "One more time." Adam grabbed the handles with him, their combined strength bearing down with every ounce they had. The cutters groaned, the chain groaned with them. For a moment, it seemed they would lose again. The snip. The chain split apart, the sound ringing like a victory bell through the storm. The shepherd stumbled forward, collapsing out of the circle that had held him captive. "Easy, boy," Mr. Daniels said, but the dog had no strength left for caution. His legs wobbled, his body swaying as though he were drunk from weakness. He staggered through the open gate, his eyes still fixed on Emma as if she alone had pulled him free. Time slowed in that moment. The shepherd's paws splashed in the puddles as he stumbled toward her. Emma stretched her arms through the bars, waiting. Each step he took seemed heavier than the last, but he pressed on, driven by something stronger than exhaustion. And then, with one final effort, he pushed himself through the open gap of the gate. He crossed the small stretch of grass, rain pelting down, his breath ragged. At last, he collapsed right at Emma's feet. The little girl gasped, dropping to her knees in the mud without hesitation. She placed her tiny hands on his wet fur, her pink dress soaking through instantly. The German shepherd let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered his head into her lap. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the patter of rain and the soft sound of the dog's breath against her dress. Emma bent low, pressing her cheek against his wet head. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I won't leave you." The shepherd's tail moved, just once, a faint wag, as if he understood. Mrs. Lopez's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Adam blinked hard, trying to mask the lump in his throat. Even Mr. Daniels, the stern caretaker who rarely let emotions show, turned his face away for a moment, swallowing heavily. Neighbors who had begun to gather at the sound of the commotion stood frozen, phones in hand, watching this unlikely rescue. Some had umbrellas, some were drenched by the rain, but all of them were silent, caught in the sacredness of the scene. The youngest child in the park had become the bravest of them all. Emma cradled the shepherd's head as he lay in her lap. His eyes fluttered shut, not in surrender but in relief, his body finally allowed to rest because he had found someone who cared. And in that rain-soaked bus yard, a bond was born, between a child who had refused to look away and a dog who had almost lost hope. They brought the German shepherd into the little town clinic, just as the rain had begun to fade into mist. Mr. Daniels and Adam carried the weak body between them, their boots splashing across the puddles outside before pushing through the glass door. The bell above rang with a soft chime, but no one noticed except little Emma, who clutched her toy close and hurried behind them. Her pink dress was still damp, her curls stuck to her forehead, and her wide eyes never left the animal that had collapsed in her lap only moments earlier. Dr. Helen, the town's only veterinarian, looked up in shock. She had treated all kinds of creatures in her long years of work: horses, cows, cats, stray dogs, but she froze at the sight of the shepherd. His ribs pressed out sharply against his soaked fur, his legs trembled even as he lay limp, and his eyes, though half-closed, flickered as if begging for another chance. "Set him here," she said quickly, rushing forward. They lowered him gently onto the padded table, and the room fell silent except for the dog's shallow breathing. Emma scrambled onto a stool right beside him. She placed her tiny hand on his paw, whispering softly, "It's okay, you're safe now." The shepherd stirred faintly at her touch, as though those few words carried more medicine than any injection. Dr. Helen bent down, her hands moving quickly but carefully. She checked his heartbeat, pressed along his bruised chest, and shook her head softly. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, and bruised all over. But he's a fighter. He wants to live." Emma's mother, who had come rushing from the hospital after hearing the news, stepped inside still wearing her nurse's scrubs. She knelt by her daughter, holding her shoulders gently. "Sweetheart, you've done something very brave," she whispered, her voice trembling between pride and fear. Emma leaned closer to the shepherd's ear, her little voice barely more than a breath. "Your name is Shadow," she said, as if the name had been waiting all along. The moment hung heavy in the room. The dog, so frail and beaten, wagged his tail, just once, soft against the table, but clear enough for everyone to see. Tears filled Emma's mother's eyes, and even Mr. Daniels turned away, pretending to fuss with his cap. The name had been chosen, and somehow the animal accepted it in that instant. But Shadow refused to rest. Each time Dr. Helen tried to coax him down, he stirred again, lifting his muzzle weakly, his eyes darting around the room. It wasn't until Emma slid down from the stool, placed both her hands gently on his face, and rested her cheek against his wet fur that he let out a long sigh. Only then did his trembling ease. His head lowered again, and finally he surrendered to sleep. Outside that quiet clinic, the world was already beginning to notice. Someone had recorded the rescue in the bus yard, the moment the rusty chain snapped, the child's hands reaching through the fence, and the dog stumbling forward only to collapse in her lap. The clip spread from one phone to another, faster than anyone expected. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, strangers across town were calling Emma the little guardian. The clinic doorbell never seemed to stop ringing after that. Neighbors came with blankets, dog food, and donations. Children drew pictures of a little girl holding a dog with bright eyes. Letters arrived, thanking her for reminding everyone that kindness still mattered. For many, it wasn't just about a dog, it was about a small child who refused to walk away when everyone else had. Through all the noise, Emma hardly noticed the cameras or the chatter. She stayed planted in the same spot by Shadow's side, her toy tucked into her lap, her small hand stroking his fur whenever he stirred. The dog, bruised but breathing, never let his gaze wander far from her. She had become his anchor, his shadow, just as he had become hers. One evening, when the clinic was finally quiet and only the hum of machines filled the air, Emma's mother leaned down and brushed a curl from her forehead. "You know, Emma," she whispered, "sometimes kindness is noticed when no one else is watching. You didn't help him because people would clap. You helped him because your heart told you not to walk away." Emma didn't say much. She only looked at Shadow, whose chest rose and fell in steady rhythm now, and nodded with the serious understanding only a child could carry. In her small world, she didn't need fame or praise. She had already received the only reward that mattered, the wag of a tired tail, the warmth of a loyal heart, and a bond that was already unbreakable. And so, in that little town clinic, with rain still dripping softly against the windows, a broken dog and a brave child began healing together. One had found a name. The other had found a friend. And the whole town had found a reason to believe again. By late afternoon the clinic was quiet. Rain had passed, fogging the windows and leaving the room smelling of wet fur. Emma sat cross-legged on a blanket beside the recovery cot. Shadow's paws twitched now and then, as if he was still running in his dreams. Dr. Helen had dimmed the lights, but Mr. Daniels stood by the door with his cap in his hands. He cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About that yard." Emma looked up. Her mother set a cup of tea down and nodded for him to go on. "Those buses weren't just left there," Mr. Daniels said. "Years back, when the district sold them off, a group rented the lot for storage. That's what they called it. But I'd hear engines at night. Crates dragged. Dogs barking. I was told it was none of my business. Just watch the gate." He swallowed. "I did as I was told. I shouldn't have." Silence settled. Shadow shifted and let out a small breath, as if his body knew the words. "I think they used the buses to move animals," he went on. "In and out. No records. No names. Once I found straw on a seat and a chew rope tied to a handrail." He met Emma's mother's eyes. "I quit soon after, but I never told the police. I just wanted it to end." Emma reached across the blanket and touched the back of Shadow's paw. The shepherd's ear flicked, listening. "Did they hurt him?" she whispered. "I don't know, little one," he said. "But he didn't get into that yard by himself." Dr. Helen lifted Shadow's lip. "Chipped tooth," she said. "Old break. And here, scar lines along the chest. Looks like a heavy harness rubbed him raw for a long time." She turned the worn collar. The leather was cracked, the buckle bent. No tag. Someone owned him or claimed to. Mr. Daniels rubbed his brow. 3 nights ago I saw fresh tracks by the side gate. Boot prints. The lock wasn't broken, just picked. I thought it was kids. Now I think those men came back to take what they left." Emma's mother glanced at the door. "Could they return for him?" "They might," he admitted. "That lot keeps a shadow even in daylight. And men like that don't like to lose." A knock sounded from the hall. Mrs. Patel from the grocery peeked in. "I brought soup," she said, "and I saw a dark van 2 mornings ago. No front plate. Windows black. It idled by the fence, then sped away." Mr. Daniels looked at the floor. "Same one I saw last week." The room felt smaller. Emma's father stepped closer to the cot. He ran a careful hand over Shadow's neck and found a thin ridge under the fur. "There's a notch here," he said. "Like a chip." Dr. Helen passed a scanner over the spot. A weak beep answered. "Old microchip," she said. "Number is faded. Registered far away. No name. No phone." Emma pressed her cheek to Shadow's shoulder. "We found you," she whispered. Shadow's tail brushed once against the blanket. Talk turned to locks and lights and who would take the night watch. Mr. Daniels offered to sleep in his truck outside the clinic. Emma's father would fix the back gate at the yard before dark. Mrs. Patel would tell the neighbors to keep eyes open. Even Dr. Helen set a heavy flashlight on the counter and checked the batteries. Emma's father tested the deadbolt twice and slid a chair under the knob. Mr. Daniels wrote the van's details on a scrap of paper and tucked it into his wallet so he wouldn't forget. As dusk fell, Emma stayed by Shadow's side. Sometimes he slept so deeply she watched to make sure he still breathed. Sometimes he woke with a jolt, muscles tight, a low sound rising from his throat. Each time, Emma laid her small hand over his heart and hummed a simple tune. The trembling eased. Mr. Daniels pulled up a chair and spoke in a soft voice, more to himself than anyone. Back then, he said, they used bus foremost. Dent over the rear wheel. Green paint under the yellow. I scrubbed at a stain that wouldn't come off. He paused. Sometimes I smell bleach when I think about it. Emma's mother knelt so she could look him in the eye. We can still do the right thing, she said. We call the police. We give statements. We protect him. He nodded. I will. Night came. Streetlights hummed over the wet pavement. Out beyond the clinic, the old yard lay dark, rows of metal in tall grass. Inside, Emma fought sleep. He might wake up scared, she whispered. Her mother spread a second blanket beside the cot. Then we will be here when he does. Emma lay on the floor, nose to nose with Shadow. She set her plastic toy, the one she had pushed along the fence, near his paw. It's yours, she said, for when I can't be here. Shadow blinked slowly, the kind of blink that means trust. He nudged the toy with his nose and let it rest there. Near midnight, Shadow began to dream. His paws twitched, faster, as if he was trying to run but could not. A thin whimper escaped him. Emma sat up and placed her hand on his head. Shoo, she breathed, beginning to sing. Not many words. Only a line about sunlight and home, soft and steady, until his breathing slowed. Somewhere in the singing, Emma's own eyes drifted shut, her cheek finding its place on his side. Behind that quiet, plans gathered like tools on a bench. In the morning they would return to the yard, check nearby cameras, and ask the school district for old records. They would bring a new lock and a heavy chain for the gate. And a camera. They would trace the microchip if they could and keep a lookout for the dark van. They would be ready if the men ever returned, and they would not be alone. For now there was only the rain starting again on the roof, the tick of the wall clock, and the even breaths of two lives pressed close. The truth about Shadow was not yet whole, but its edges had appeared. He had been used and then left. He had been afraid and now he was found. And in the space between those things, a small child kept watch, singing a dog back into the world. The night was still, the kind of silence that follows a long rain. Puddles gleamed under the street lamps, and the old bus yard loomed across from the clinic like a skeleton of forgotten days. Emma had drifted to sleep curled up beside Shadow, her small fingers tangled in his fur. Shadow, though resting, kept one ear cocked toward the window, his chest rising with quiet but alert breaths. It was past midnight when the sound came. Low at first, then growing, a vehicle rolling slow along the road. Shadow's head snapped up, ears stiff. He lifted his muzzle, nostrils twitching. A faint growl rose in his throat. Headlights swept across the cracked walls of the yard. The beam lingered too long, searching as if hungry. Then the van rolled closer, its engine rumbling before going quiet. The dark van. The same one neighbors had whispered about. Two doors opened. Boots splashed in the wet gravel. Shadow stood, every muscle tense, his eyes locked on the glass door. Emma stirred, rubbing her eyes. Shadow, she mumbled, her voice soft with sleep. Then the noise of the chain-link gate. The rasp of metal against metal. They were inside. Two shadows moved between the rusting buses, carrying tools, whispering in hurried voices. Shadow's growl deepened, louder this time. He stepped over Emma, his body shielding hers, hackles raised. The sound was low and dangerous, a promise. Emma's little hand pressed against his back. She didn't cry, but her eyes widened with fear. The figures crept closer. One pulled a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the clinic wall. "Erase the cameras," a voice muttered. "Grab the dog if you see him." He's worth more than the rest. Shadow barked, sharp and fierce, the kind of bark that cut the night in half. Emma gasped, then cried out, "Help! Please!" Her small voice carried across the neighborhood. Windows opened. Curtains pulled back. A porch light clicked on, then another, until the row of houses glowed against the dark. Doors swung wide. People rushed out in their slippers and coats. Mr. Daniels was the first. He came running with a flashlight and an iron rod in his hand. "Stay back from the clinic," he shouted. The men froze for a moment, then cursed and tried to move faster. Shadow planted himself at the door, teeth bared, his growls filling the street. When one man dared to step closer, Shadow lunged forward, jaws snapping inches from the iron bars of the clinic gate. The man stumbled back with a startled yell. More neighbors poured out now, Mrs. Patel clutching her shawl, Adam with his work gloves, a dozen others with nothing but their voices. "What's going on? Who are they? Get away from that dog." The men realized too late that the night no longer belonged to them. They turned to run for the van, but the community closed in. Mr. Daniels swung the iron rod down in front of them, blocking their path. Adam and two others grabbed hold of one man's arms, wrestling him to the ground. Another group formed a barrier in front of the second man. The street echoed with shouts and the scuffle of feet on wet pavement. Inside the clinic, Emma pressed her face against Shadow's shoulder. He didn't leave her side, even as his body trembled with the urge to fight. His eyes blazed, following every movement outside, ready to defend. And then came the sirens. Red and blue lights flashed against the walls of the yard, splashing color across the rusting buses. Two police cars skidded to a stop, officers leaping out with firm commands. "Hands where we can see them. Step away." The men tried one last push to break free, but there was no escape. Within minutes they were handcuffed, their angry voices drowned out by the cheers of the neighbors. Officers searched the van and pulled out chains, cages, and documents, evidence enough. "They're traitors," one officer said grimly. "Illegal transport. We've been hunting them for weeks." The officer in charge looked at the little clinic where Emma stood in the doorway now, Shadow still at her side. Her pink dress was wrinkled, her cheeks wet with tears, but her chin lifted bravely. Shadow pressed close, his fur brushing against her hand. The officer crouched down, his stern face softening. From his pocket he pulled a small ribbon with a brass pin. "Young lady," he said gently, "tonight you were braver than many grown-ups I've met. You spoke when it mattered, and you helped save a life." He pinned the ribbon onto her dress. Emma blinked at it, unsure what to say. Then she looked at Shadow. The shepherd wagged his tail once, slow but strong, and rested his head against her leg. She smiled through her tears. The crowd clapped. Some wiped their eyes. In that moment, under the glow of porch lights and flashing sirens, the town saw not just a toddler but a guardian. And beside her, the dog who had been abandoned now stood tall, proud, and unbroken. For the first time in a long while, the old bus yard was no longer a place of shadows. It was the place where a community rose together, where a child's cry woke the world, and where a chained life was finally set free. The next morning, the town woke to a new kind of silence, not the heavy silence of secrets, but one filled with relief. The van was gone, the men were in custody, and for the first time, people dared to smile when they passed the old bus yard. At the clinic, Shadow stretched carefully on his mat, no longer trembling with fear. His eyes followed Emma's every step, tail thumping whenever she came close. The police had scanned his old microchip, searched every record, and reached their conclusion: no one rightful remained to claim him. He was, in the eyes of the law, free. The townspeople didn't hesitate. "He belongs with her," Mrs. Patel said firmly, and the others nodded. No one argued. Everyone had seen the way the dog leaned into Emma's tiny hand, the way he had refused to move from her side even when danger crept close. That afternoon, the vet, Dr. Helen, knelt with a new collar in her hands. It was sturdy leather, smooth and shining. Attached to it was a polished tag engraved with simple words: Shadow, Guardian of Hope. Emma giggled when she fastened it around his neck. "Now you're ours forever," she whispered, and Shadow pressed his nose to her cheek as if he understood. The news spread far beyond the little neighborhood. People who had seen the videos online came to visit the yard, leaving flowers, food, and even small toys for Emma and Shadow. But Emma's mother kept reminding her gently, "We didn't help for the world to see, my darling. We helped because it was right." Still, the community wanted something permanent. Within a week, neighbors and workers gathered at the old yard. The broken fences were mended, rusted gates replaced, weeds cleared away. Children who once feared the place now played there, their laughter echoing through the empty buses. At the center, near the spot where Emma had first heard that faint cry, a small plaque was placed. "Here, a child's kindness saved a life. May we never walk past a cry for help again." The words glinted softly in the sun, and people paused to read them with tears in their eyes. For Emma, life began to feel lighter. She had a new rhythm now, morning hugs with Shadow, afternoons spent drawing while he napped beside her, evenings walking with her parents as he trotted proudly at her side. She was no longer just the quiet toddler in the pink dress. She was the little guardian, and her bravery had left a mark that even grown-ups couldn't forget. One morning, just as the sun was breaking through a sky washed clean by rain, Emma slipped out of the house with Shadow. She wore her favorite pink dress, its hem brushing against the tops of her little shoes. Shadow padded silently beside her, his new tag catching the first rays of light. They walked together to the yard. A shallow puddle had formed where the ground dipped between the buses, glimmering like a tiny fountain. Emma sat down beside it, resting her toy on the wet earth, while Shadow lay close enough that his warm fur touched her side. She leaned against him, sighing with the contentment only children know. The world was quiet, but not empty, filled with the sound of his breath, the rhythm of her own heartbeat, and the soft whisper of the wind through the grass. Above them, the first bird of morning sang. The puddle shimmered, reflecting the new sun. For Emma, it felt like the whole yard was alive again, not with fear but with hope. If anyone had been there to listen, they would have heard a voice, soft, steady, like a story told just for them. Sometimes the smallest hands do the greatest acts of kindness. Sometimes love is the loudest rescue. Emma wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, her cheek pressed into his fur. He stayed perfectly still, letting her hold him as long as she wished. And so, in the place once marked by rust and silence, a child and a dog sat together at sunrise. One had found safety. The other had found courage. And together, they had given the whole town a reason to believe again. The sun climbed higher, scattering the clouds. The yard gleamed with new light. Emma giggled, Shadow wagged his tail, and the story of the little guardian and her shadow lived on, not just in memory, but in the heart of everyone who passed that quiet place and paused to remember.